and welcome to the Wellness with Juanita podcast. I'm your host, Juanita Nagai, an American living in Japan for 20 years. I've gone through some massive life changes and crises in my 20 years here. At its bleakest, I felt very isolated, alone, and helpless in the face of what was happening. I relied on alcohol and cigarettes to get through it the best I knew how, which worked until it didn't, and everything fell apart. I made it through with a little help from my friends, a fledgling mindfulness practice, and learning how to become my own strongest ally. I quit drinking and smoking, worked my way through my grief, found ways to forgive, created new connections, and started a regular exercise, meditation, and self-care routine. I've also become a national board certified health and wellness coach along the way, and developed a desire and passion to help others on their own personal journeys. This podcast is all about change, growth, healing yourself, learning how to get back up after life kicks you down, and exploring mindfulness and self-compassion as incredible tools available to each and every one of us to do just that. Hello, and welcome to the Wellness with Juanita podcast. I'm your host, Juanita Nagai. Today, I want to talk to you about learning from limits, how we can actually learn from our limitations or constraints or the lemons that life serves us up, which is very contrary to the way that I think most of us usually function and think about things. And so I just find this a very fascinating topic that's kind of been swirling around in my head in the past few days and week as I've been listening to the various podcasts that are always in my queue. All of these different well-being, mental health, personal development, meditation podcasts seem to be rotating around the author David Epstein, who has recently released a new book, something about inside the box. I will put the correct title and the link to his book in the show notes. So full disclosure, I have not actually read the book myself yet. It sounds very interesting. He's talking about how when we are limited in some way, that is actually when we are the most creative, perhaps the most productive or industrious or resilient. Basically, if we feel ourselves stuck inside a box, we then need to really push ourselves and really use all of our emotional resilience, creativity, resources we have at our disposal to think outside the box and get ourselves beyond it. Right? So I just find it really, really fascinating because I certainly would love to have more time, money, freedom, all of these things that I think a lot of us kind of idealize and romanticize and maybe even fantasize about. If only I had all the time in the world, then I would do X, Y, and Z. If only I had a vast fortune, then I would be able to do this, that, and the other. And while there is certainly so much room within this discussion to kind of talk about the nuances when you are literally scraping by trying to survive, then yes, more time, money, and energy is going to help you just survive better, and it will help you flourish up to a certain point. What he is talking about and where I want to kind of stay with in the framework of today is that when it is truly limitless, when we truly just have no constraints, we actually don't know what to do, or we don't do it in a very good way. We need some kind of constraint to kind of formulate or define the problem or the situation that we find ourselves in order to be able to find a very specific and doable solution to that. So before I get too far in the weeds and just talking kind of theoretically and have people attack the thought that, having all the time or money or energy or resources is in somehow not an idealized, perfect, wonderful thing that we should all be striving for, perhaps it will help to bring you into some of the personal examples that I have been kind of turning over in my mind ever since I first heard this. So, when I first came to Japan, I actually came when I was 16 for a 1-month homestay. My Spanish teacher had passed along a letter to me that was advertising for these over summer vacation homestay programs in various countries throughout the world. I actually came with the Lions Club and I chose Japan. I decided I wanted to come to Japan, and this would have been in 1995, and the entire trip was $1,800, which was an insane amount of money for me at the time. There was no way my parents or my family would have been able to just give me that money and be like, here you go on a trip. No problem, undaunted. I didn't even really think about it, except that I chose Japan rather than New Zealand because it was half as much money. So I was thinking, okay, we don't want to go to New Zealand. That seems really out of reach, but somehow I will find a way to get to Japan for $1,800. And that was my limit. That was my constraint. And I had to think creatively to get myself out of that box. I was going to Japan. I had decided. There was no ifs, ands, or buts about it. So I had to figure out how I was going to raise that money. And this was definitely before GoFundMe or even the internet and smartphones and technology as we know it today. And so I sat down and I started writing letters to absolutely everyone I knew. So all of my friends and family, acquaintances, associates, the staff at the hospital that my mom worked at, one of the very kind doctors gave me a $400 check. Just anyone I could think of. I sent letters to the Department of International Studies at Andrews University in Michigan randomly just because I found that they had an international studies or some kind of international program department or person to address a letter to, and they sent me a check for $10. And whoever answered the letter said, of course our university cannot give you any money, but I am touched and impressed by your letter and I'd like to support this. And she personally gave me $10. I just crowdfunded in whatever way I could think of. The Lions Club in my hometown also did give me, I remember, kind of a big chunk, maybe another $400. But honestly, I raised the money through $10 here, $20 there, just however I knew. I was working my summer part-time job, so I was trying to do my part that way. I think in the end, I raised all but maybe $200 or $250, and that is what my mom donated. And so I was able to come to Japan. And as they say, the rest is history, because here I am, however many 30-something years later living here. So it obviously had a very deep impression on my life and its trajectory and everything. But how many people actually do have the money, do have parents that could afford to send them abroad anywhere in the world, and don't do it, don't take that path, don't choose to do that? Because I wanted to do this particular thing, because I wanted to come to Japan on that trip, and because I did not have money, I needed to find a way, a creative solution to get me here. And so having that limit and having that constraint forced me to really kind of be creative and use all of my powers of resourcefulness and just really thinking outside the box to figure out a solution. So there was that. I was also thinking about just growing up in my hometown. If it hadn't been the very rural, conservative, small, kind of, to me, feeling constricted and constrictive place that I grew up and went through the school system there from kindergarten through grade 12. I knew I wanted to experience the world and see outside of that actual constraint and that very small box that I grew up in and lived in until I was 18 was the catalyst that made me open my gaze so wide that I went on the other side of the world. Not only did I know I was going to college, I knew I was going to college out of state, and I knew that there was so much more world out there outside of what I had always known. Without that constraint, I don't know that I would have left if I lived in a really great, liberal, open-minded, peaceful, ideal utopia. I probably wouldn't want to leave. And then I would never have known how much else is out here and is available in the world, right? So in my own life, just kind of thinking about, okay, yeah, these like kind of catalyst moments, even at my lowest moments, even when I was really suffering and dealing with overwhelming grief and loss, I felt so isolated and so alone. And that is one reason that I put out this podcast and I work with others, because I didn't realize how much help and how much support was out there and was available, and how much I could do for myself even in my darkest hour. So it's really a way to try and help nearly 10 years ago me now at this point, is to offer the fact that we are not alone and that there is support and there is always something that we can do for ourselves. But because I felt that way, because I felt so isolated, because my husband was literally physically living in another prefecture, I hit rock bottom and I kind of had my dark night of the soul moment, and that constraint of that overwhelming suffering is what pushed me really into finding a way out. I knew I couldn't continue to live the way that I was living. I knew that just drinking myself into oblivion and then bawling for hours on end as I chain smoked and tried to make sense of the mess of my life, that was not helping. And I was not being the kind of parent that I wanted to be for my daughter. And most importantly, I just couldn't continue living the way that I felt. I just was so wretched, and there were so many layers of denials and resentment and anger and all of these things layered on top of the heart of the matter, which is I was just so grief-stricken and hurt and broken. And so I didn't want to feel that way anymore. And nothing in my life was changing in a magic wand kind of a way to relieve that suffering. I finally reached a point where I realized like it truly was up to me. If I wanted to feel differently, if I wanted to start feeling better, I needed to do something. I needed to find a way to start to dig myself out of the hole of despair that I had kind of fallen into. And that was the beginning of my path. So even in that really unpleasant, let us say, dark, deepest suffering moment, if it hadn't been for those constraints, if it hadn't been for the situation being what it was, I never would have taken those first steps. I never would have gotten to where I am now if my life had not unfolded the way that it did. And so this is not a Pollyanna, the glass is always half full, or I'm looking back with, 20/20 vision and hindsight and rosy glasses and whatever metaphors you want to throw in there. That is not this. That is not what I'm trying to say. But I am reflecting and noticing how it really is the limits and the constraints, and when we feel our back pushed up against the wall, as when real change or real progress, or even kind of that just mindset shift can begin to happen. When we're floating along the river of life and sailing along and everything's more or less great, we don't change and we don't do anything differently because everything's more or less great. As humans, biologically, psychologically, in all of these different systems we crave homeostasis. We want to return to the baseline and to the normal, whether that's our heart rate or our mental state, whatever it is, we want things to be the same. The reason that life is so hard and so challenging is because nothing stays the same. And so it's these two forces that we are negotiating and we are trying to navigate as we go through life. And so this kind of gets me to where I wanted to go in a kind of grander, bigger, wider lens perspective sense. Yes, there are specific solutions that we can maybe perhaps more creatively find when we are forced into a corner or when the box is really small and really confined. If we are completely smothered and locked inside the box with a key, we can't move. And that's where I think I was kind of trying to voice the feeling of just trying to survive within a box doesn't work. Right? We need to have enough space to breathe, enough room to be able to think outside the box, but then the box is kind of what is helpful, I suppose. So getting back to this bigger perspective, this bigger, wider lens, it's also making me realize that tension and that kind of yin-yang of life, that it is our suffering and it is the problems and the challenges and the things that we encounter that often push us to grow and that often teach us the most, and as unpleasant and as unfortunate, and as much as we might even wish that they never happened, the fact remains that if it weren't for those things, we wouldn't become the people that we are meant to be. And so it's also making me pause and think about this beautiful Jack Kornfield quote or question. I can't remember. Maybe it's a question, the way that I have been thinking about it. He asks, "What will you do with the measure of your suffering?" And it's a big question. It's a weighty question, but I think it's one of the most important, because it's really asking how we will choose to live our lives. Like, what will we place as the most important and the most valuable intentions in our lives, so that we can keep them as our kind of guiding North Star in mind, even when we are faced with whatever bucket loads of lemons the universe has to throw at us, right? How will you hold the measure of your suffering? What will you do with it? Will you let it take you down? Or will you find a way to transform it and to grow from it and to learn from it? And I'd like to speak for a moment to perhaps people out there that might be listening to this and might just be recoiling and pushing back and just saying, but, because I can hear an old voice in my own mind that's doing that very thing. There's an old version of me, maybe when my daughter was small and I was working full time and I had a young child and life was beyond full, beyond busy, beyond stressed out, lack of sleep, all of the things that come with being a full-time working mother and living in this modern day age. I didn't have time. I didn't have energy. I had all of these limits placed upon me, and they were not helpful. They weren't forcing me to be creative. They were just limits. And I just felt suppressed by them. I just felt the constraints. I didn't feel any of the creativity. And I think that's really relatable for a lot of people. I think that it's just like, no, I need the time. Yeah, like I want the more time. I want the magical utopia and the week on the beach with nothing to do. Like that would be heavenly, right? But then what would you actually do? That's kind of the question. Now that I do work for myself and I do work from home, I have noticed as well, when I have absolutely nothing on my calendar, it's overwhelming. It's intimidating. I need a little bit of structure to my days or my weeks to be able to see, okay, well, this day I need to record my podcast. And this day I'm going to do admin. And this day I have clients at these times. So I need to work in my workouts and my meditation and my self-care practices around these other things. When it's completely wide open, as delightful and intriguing and envious as that might sound to old me, I don't know what to do. I can fill up some of that time. I mean, I always do find a way to fill up that time, but I feel like it's almost like a really common modern day occurrence when we sit down and we've got like 10 minutes to ourselves. And what do? I think 90% of us pick up our phone and we just start scrolling through social media. It's just what we do, right? It's like we have that time, but we just waste it. And without having some kind of limits or constraints, or maybe it's even just structure is a word I don't really like, but it's almost kind of like scaffolding or just an outline or some kind of framing to our lives or our weeks or days. We just kind of don't do anything. And we don't know what to do with ourselves. And so it really is in our struggles and in our limits and in what life is throwing at us that we learn how to best live it and how to prioritize the things that are really important to us. So let's go back to over 10 years ago me that was stressed out and wanted more time and energy and and all of those things that would have been like, what are you talking about? If she were listening to me ramble on about how it's great to have limits and constraints. It actually was in that life that also started to push me in the direction of thinking outside of the box and thinking, well, I have to work full time. I have to make this salary. I have to do these things to provide for my family. I just had this mindset for many different reasons, but I have always worked and I am still working, but I'm starting to understand that the work that you do is not always necessarily financially compensated in the ways that you would like. And I'm also very aware that things take time, and I am sitting in that. But even there, the constraints that I have, I am having to think creatively. And I'm thinking, okay, so that's my constraint. What do I do to make some money? And I'm finding ways to just pick up some side jobs. I'm also finding ways to do the work that's important to me, even if it's not always financially rewarded. And so I am being creative and I'm exploring other things. I'm volunteering my time and my expertise in other ways. And so I'm building this life that feels meaningful and feels fulfilling and feels like the kind of life that I don't want to escape. And I don't want to run away to the beach for a week with nothing to do, because I actually like this life that I'm building. All of the rewards and the self-care and the ease is built into it very intentionally, because that's what is important to me and that's the kind of life that I want to live. So I only got here because I was there. And I was so miserable and unhappy and unfulfilled and did not like my job and did not like that existence. And I'm not saying that we all have the same privilege or the same options or the same choices. If I was a single mother, everything would be different. I have a partner who has a stable enough job that we are figuring things out as we go along. And I know that's not an option for everyone. What I am trying to highlight and I'm trying to say today is that whatever our limits and our constraints and whatever our life situation is, the potential and the possibilities for change are present right there, wherever you are, within whatever constraints you have. It's not something that we wait for or we wish for. You know, we could hope that we win the lottery or go out and play the lottery every day, and it's probably not going to happen in this lifetime. What can you do to actually change your life or your habits or your mindset, whatever it is, so that it doesn't feel like such a limit and it doesn't feel so constrained anymore? If you are so unhappy because you are overwhelmed, overworked, and have no time to yourself, but you commute every day, for example, like someone I know, I decided to use my morning commute as my reading time in the morning because I love to read and it's a stress reliever. It's one of my hobbies and a self-care activity. So every morning I read on the way to work, and every afternoon I meditated. I popped in my earpods and listened to a guided meditation on the way home. And so I found a way to do two things that were very important to me, even within the constrained, limited life that I was living. Again, I'm not talking about survival mode, and I'm not talking about finding a way to feed your family at a very visceral level. I'm talking about within a constrained modern day working full-time mom life, I started to find a way to change little things to begin to create the life that I am living now, that is so much more on the path of where I know I'm headed and where I want to be. And I wouldn't have gotten here without all of the heartache and all of the suffering and all of the grief and the loss, as hard as it was, but also without the limits and constraints of the job that I hated. And I was so completely burnt out and over years before I finally found a way to leave it. And so we really kind of need to be pushed and recognize that our limits and the box, whatever it is that we might find ourselves in, is not the end of the story. The box is inviting us and encouraging us to think our way outside of it. So for today's takeaway, I invite you to look at your life, look at somewhere that you feel unsatisfied or disgruntled, or you wish things were different. And maybe wish is a really great word to pick up on here. Where in your life have you kind of been waiting for the fairy godmother or the magic to happen where, well, if only I had that, I wish this, I wish that. Think about your wishes and think about it in a really actual, real way. What is it that you want to change? What is it that you wish you had more of in your life? Or how could you actually start to play around with that? If you wish that you had more time, but you work full time and you're commuting so long, and I get it, I really, really do. But where can you wiggle within that? What could you change? If you want more time to yourself, can you give yourself commuting time? Or, even if you're driving, can you listen to a podcast that inspires you or ignites your interest? There are so many little tiny things that we can do that totally count. And that is actually the only place where change actually happens, is with the really tiny little baby steps. So I really invite you to think about some place that you feel stuck and you don't like where the box is drawn around you. Don't think about the end result necessarily. Just think about what's one tiny little baby step that you can do to kind of get you going in the direction of like, well, what could I actually do there? How could things maybe change? And I will leave you with that for today. If you made it this far, I really appreciate all the support. If you have any questions or you're interested in engaging in this conversation further, I invite you to book a discovery call from my calendar. All of the links to my website and my DMs and social media accounts are in the show notes. Until next time, thanks for listening and take care.